What's up guys, it's Double Zug. So I know I haven't made a video in a bit here, but if there's anything that's going to bring me back, it's this kind of crazy class tune we just got. So if you've been paying attention, you probably have already seen this blue post. A lot of stuff to like a bunch of DPS specs, some tanks, and also most of the healers were touched except Holy Priest, which just kind of got a drive-by nerf. Kind of a funny way, we'll talk about later, but I'm going to go through these point by point. First of all, I think this is a really good, like, it's heartening, right? A lot of people were dooming about Cataclysm not getting dev attention, and I think stuff like this, as well as the big quality of life changes they've been doing on the beta and stuff, are a good indicator that the devs are paying a lot more attention to MoP. A little bit of hopium there. Let's start with Resto Druid. Resto Druid got the least changes other than Holy Priest, which I think is good. I think Resto Druid is probably like a good target if they are going to be actively balancing the spec. So what did they change? They basically just gave them a 5% aura buff to their healing. This passive pretty much affects like all your spells, so which is again not like huge, not game breaking, just a little bit of a bonus. It doesn't like make them better than Shaman, but huge changes weren't necessary. Druid's pretty balanced. And Druid utility with like Roar and Symbiosis is obviously really nice to have. So Mistweaver I'm going to talk about last because it's really in depth. So let's talk about Paladin next here. Paladin got 3 changes. We got the Eternal Flame not being affected by Mastery in 5.4 reverted. Also meaningfully reverted the like healing buff to Eternal Flame. In phase 1 gear, even with the 2% Mastery buff that's also a 5.3 revert that they're doing, you actually like don't have 29% mastery in like a normal gear set where you're prioring like haste or spirit. This is actually not like an overall healing buff. The mastery buff is about like a 1.2% healing increase. Again, because they're reducing the hot healing by 28%, your overall like raw throughput is not actually going to be increased because your mastery isn't more than that 28%. However, it will shift a lot of your healing profile away from like beacon and direct heals to absorbs. So it's like 4k mastery, it's about a 3% loss, but you're also going to be increasing the absorbs you generate by 25% in EF. And EF's weakness previously was low absorbs and high beacon healing. So you're overhealing. If your overhealing is really, really high, this is obviously going to be a lot better. Also, the play pattern of like blanketing absorbs can give you a little bit of a spirit shell type healing profile where you can pre-heal big bursts of damage. It's not like an overall throughput buff really until you get a lot higher in mastery, but it is like a qualitative buff to the spec and at very high levels of overhealing. However, even at like 50% overhealing, this is still like a little bit of a loss, again at like 4k mastery, but if your mastery is a lot higher than this, it will be less than this. However, mastery is like not actually that good of a stat even for Eternal Flame with the mastery change. So overall, like very, very underwhelming buffs to Holy Paladin in my opinion, not really addressing the problems. You're really never going to be competing with a Discipline Priest for absorbs and for pre-generating absorbs. Paladin's main problems are just kind of like low overall HPS, although their overall HPS is like not as low as you really might think, and basically 0 damage. So I think you either need to bring something like Discipline Priest damage down, or you need to buff Paladin's healing to such an extreme extent that they become like, you know, go-to raid healers or something. This is not enough. So for all the Paladin hopium copers out there, it is a little bit of a buff, but I don't think this is significant enough at all to really make Holy Paladin like viable or meta. It's a little bit of a bummer here for Holy Paladin. Again, very surprised that like Mistweaver got such insane changes. And even Druid got like a 5% buff, and then Paladin got like just this. Again, hopefully they keep iterating on this and Holy Paladin gets a little bit more help from this, although honestly, it's fine if Holy Paladin has an expansion where they're dog shit and bad. They've just been on top for so long that, you know, we all kind of want to see him in the dust for an expansion or two. Priest got a lot of changes, although most of them are focused on the 90 row talents, which got very, very significant nerfs. The base changes to Discipline are Divine Aegis is lowered to 80% of the heal's value. The way that DA works is like, it basically replaces your crit and doubles that healing as an absorb. It also double dips on mastery, so you get your like direct healing mastery on the initial hit, and then when the absorb is generated, you get mastery again. But this basically means in phase 1 levels of mastery is that you get like 30% less crit multi, which is about like a 5% healing loss. So this is actually a little bit smaller than it looks. It's only 5%, but critically that 5% is absorb, and absorb is very low overhealing relative to the direct healing that's going to be unnerfed by this. So it's going to be a little bit more in terms of your effective healing than 5%. The tier 14 set bonus is just a small nerf to it. It's not really that big of a deal, honestly. It just means you don't really care about tier as much, which is fine, right? You might end up wearing off pieces. The tier set before was actually mostly a DPS increase. It was only like 4 or 5% healing, but like 20% DPS. Really, this is actually just going to lower your damage by quite a significant amount, which I think is fine. Discipline Priest damage is way too high anyways. The second big general change is Atonement healing. Damage lowered to 70% from 90%. So the amount of damage that you convert is reduced by like a little bit more than 20%, right? Because 90 to 70 is 20%, but 20% is a little more than 20% of 90. So it's like 22.22% reduction in atonement healing. Again, it's about another 5% loss. 5 to 6% loss. Pretty significant there, right, with these two things combined. I do like the direction they're going here, but personally, I would have much rather they nerf the damage and not the conversion. I think Discipline Priest single target damage is too high compared to the other healers, and it's just a really hard damage problem to solve with balancing, with like Mistweaver and Discipline Priest having such a crazy higher amount of damage than the other healers. Something like Holy Paladin, like it's super hard to balance something that just does 0 DPS when there's healers that can do healing and also do like 40% of a DPS worth of damage. But this way around I think is fine. It does make it a little bit less punishing to cast your like casted heals, you know, like your Prayer of Healing, your Prayer of Mending. You know, these are pretty efficient, good spells, even like Binding Heal and your single target heals. With 90% atonement conversion, just pressing Smite's usually the answer. So making Smite not always the answer is good for the overall playstyle. The last like general Disc Priest change is Spirit Shell had its duration increased by 50% to 15 seconds. I think this is going to be like less impactful than people think, honestly. It's very good. It's a reversion from the 5.4 nerf. I think this is a fine reversion. It will definitely, combine with like the Divine Aegis and Atonement nerfs, mean that most of our pre-shielding is going to be active instead of passive, which I think is good. So putting the power in Spirit Shell versus like just Divine Aegis and your 90 row talents is going to be overall better for like skill expression and cooldown usage and stuff like that. It's going to make it a little bit more important to use your Spirit Shell at the right time. All right, so now let's get into the 90 row stuff. So this is also going to be a drive-by nerf to Holy Priest I mentioned before. It's actually going to be a very significant nerf to Holy Priest, which I think is hilarious given that Holy Priest is like pretty bad and needs buffs. Divine Star and Halo now obey AoE cap rules, which is 20 targets for damage. I think this is like actually hard capped for damage at 20. And 6 targets for healing before they start splitting the effect's total numbers. So this implies that it's hard capped at 6, but that would be like a very, very extreme nerf. It would be like 80% less healing on 25 targets. You know, this would be kind of a crazy nerf. So I think it might actually be like a square root scaling, which would be a little bit more reasonable and still a crazy nerf to the overall healing of both Halo and D-Star, but not as extreme as like hard capping it. And this is something that we definitely need to keep an eye on the raid testing, like how this AoE cap actually works, because I'm not sure and I couldn't find any like logs or old stuff to confirm. So I've basically modeled this assuming that it's square root capped at 6, and even with the square root cap at 6 on like a 25-man stack, if you can hit the whole raid with Divine Star combined with this other nerf, which is just 25% lower healing for Divine Star specifically, not affecting Halo or Cascade, you're doing like 60% less healing, and you're losing like, you know, we do 150k on the full raid stack here, and pre-nerf we were doing 300k. So this is like literally you do 50% less healing with these nerfs combined on a full raid stack with your Divine Star. So before we were like as good or better than Resto Shaman at healing rot damage when the raid is full stacked in 25-man, and now we just basically cannot do that anymore. We're much more just a damage to healing and absorb like Spirit Shell spec, and less of just an insane output throughput spec. The maximum bounces on Cascade being lowered doesn't matter in 10-man because it's 15 bounces, but in 25-man, going from like 30 bounces to 15 is a pretty significant nerf. Especially, you know, I was seeing a lot of logs Cascade bouncing to like pets and like army ghouls and stuff like that, which if they fix that and it prioritizes players, Cascade actually looks pretty good now compared to Divine Star and Halo. However, Cascade doesn't do any damage, so I think you're probably going to be prioritizing Divine Star or Halo anyways, even if they're hard capped at 6, just because they do a lot more damage, and Cascade doesn't do that much more healing that it really matters too much. So again, in those cases where the raid is stacked, this is like an incredibly large nerf to Discipline Priest's healing. But in those lower target environments where maybe you're hitting, you know, 15 people with your Halo, and maybe you're hitting like 6, 7, 8 players with your Divine Star, this is not hugely significant. It's like 15%, but again, that top end best case scenario is literally like 50% less healing, which is kind of insane. And if we do assume that it's actually hard capped at 6, it's like even worse than this at those high target counts. I think these nerfs are like very, very deserved, but I think that the nerfs specifically to like the target capping stuff are a little bit extreme. I personally would go the direction of nerfing Discipline Priest's damage and maybe their absorb generation and not so much their like overall HPS output. Definitely Discipline Priest needed some nerfs, and these are very extreme. However, potentially this is what was necessary to make Discipline Priest at all balanced, because Discipline Priest doing insane damage and doing all of its healing as absorbs and doing like the same amount of rot healing as Resto Shaman was really disgustingly stupid. So Holy Priest, very quick mention here, does get affected by this target capping, but the Divine Star nerf was specific to Discipline Priest. Although even with this not applying to Holy Priest, the target capping stuff is again still just a very, very significant nerf to Holy Priest in those higher target count environments like 25-man. And Holy Priest did not need a nerf. Hopefully something is done to make Holy Priest a little bit better. It's a very similar situation to Discipline where like 50% of your healing was being done by your 90 row talents. All right, let's talk about Shaman next. Shaman has some pretty significant nerfs, although honestly, these are much smaller than the Discipline Priest nerfs overall, which is kind of funny. But again, Discipline Priest needed a nerf. Shaman also needs a nerf. It has crazy cooldowns and decent damage with like Stormlash and Ellie's and stuff. So having the highest like consistent throughput plus the best cooldowns plus decent damage is like a little too much. Let's see what they do here. Healing Rain lowered by 25%. This is very significant. This is like a 40k HPS loss in Phase 1 Bisgear, 13 to 14% reduction in raw HPS. So this change itself is like very, very significant. Definitely deserved though. Healing Rain is disgusting. You can see that Healing Rain pre-nerf had like 300 HPM with conductivity, which was close to the same mana efficiency as Healing Tide Totem in 10-man. So just your like normal AoE spell was as efficient as like some of these other healers' major cooldowns. Is insane and definitely needed a nerf. Talents here. So Healing Rain's maximum duration through conductivity is lowered to 30 seconds from 40. This is actually a much smaller nerf than you think, and conductivity is still by far the best talent. Really all you lose here, because you retain the benefit of getting Unleash boost on all your Healing Rain ticks, you just lose the casting cost of one Healing Rain every 40 seconds, which is about like 2400 HPS. So this is like 1% less healing or something, very small. And does not change the ranking of the talents at all, especially combined with this next talent choice, which is that Ancestral Guidance healing and damage conversion is lowered to 20% from 60% for healing and 40% for damage. So this nerf is much more targeted towards DPS shamans, I imagine, but the healing nerf is actually like bigger than the DPS nerf, which I think is a little bit crazy given how good conductivity is. Again, 60% to 20%, you're doing 1/3 of the healing cleave. So previously in Phase 1 BIS, AG was adding like 28k HPS, and post nerf, it's like 7k. And this basically means that it's a completely dead talent for Restoration. You're always going to be picking conductivity outside of very specific fights where you're like moving an insane amount and maybe you take rushing streams. I actually don't really think this nerf was necessary for Resto Shaman specifically, but nerfing hybrid off healing is, I think, good overall for the game. So overall, I think this is a good change. So just the conductivity and Healing Rain nerfs together are going to be about like 15% less healing, but most of that is in this 25% and not in the conductivity nerf, which is not hugely significant. We got some partial reverts to 5.4 buffs to our fillers. So Chain Heal and Riptide both nerfed a little bit here. 20% healing fall off added back to Chain Heal. This is less than it originally had, but still a decent little nerf. It's about a 25% reduction in Chain Heal healing. Chain Heal isn't very much of our healing though, so this is like, you know, kind of close to the conductivity nerf, like 1.5%. The Riptide mana cost, only 15% increase. This is like about a 0.7% healing reduction, so again, very, very small nerfs here. The good thing about this though is that it keeps the ratio on the Riptide glyph so that the Riptide glyph is actually a cost to put on. Having Riptide be a more efficient filler than Chain Heal is kind of silly in my opinion, so I think this is a good change to have both of these together like this. So overall, if you just look at my like raw sim, this is about, you know, we go from like 300k to 250k raw HPS, so 16-17% reduction, pretty significant. Resto Shaman is still insanely strong. Very, very high HPS, still has like the most insane cooldowns ever, even though AG got nerfed. So I think Resto Shaman is still solidly like very, very meta. It's just you're going to have to maybe add a few more healers into the mix, especially with the amount of raw healing you're going to be losing from your Discipline Priests. Overall, good changes, not too extreme, right? So that's Shaman. We barely touched on Holy Priest, but like who cares? Nobody's playing Holy Priest. Let's talk about Mistweaver here. So Mistweaver got like the most profound changes, the most like play pattern altering changes. All the other stuff really doesn't change how you play, except maybe the EF mastery thing might make you like blanket 1 holy power EFs on the raid, but everything else is just like some numbers being adjusted. But this is like pretty profound, so I'm going to go through this here. I'm probably going to make a second video going through all the numbers and like the math and stuff, but do a really quick overview here. So teaching the monastery, Crackling Jade Lightning's damage bonus lowered to 25% from 100%. So that's very significant, right? CGL is going to be doing a quarter of the damage. However, paired with the eminence changes up here, it's actually going to be doing similar healing. This is really good. I think CGL was actually like a better damage filler than fist weaving, which was a really bad, like kind of degenerate playstyle thing. Spending all your time spamming like a channeled spell that just smart heals is not super fun, especially compared to like spamming Tiger Palm or something. So overall, very good change here. I personally would just like nerf Crackling Jade Lightning into the ground so that you never cast it, but making it do a quarter of the damage is pretty close to that, honestly. Manatee's mana return per charge increased to 5%, plus 4%. This is a pretty big increase to the mana, which is good. Mistweaver struggles with mana a lot. Surging Mist's cost lowered by 13%. Surging Mist is not a good spell mana-wise. A little bit of a mana buff to like our emergency spot healing, which I think is good. Rushing Jade Wind will now be cancelled on the Mistweaver Monk when they enter Stance of the Wise Serpent. So this is just a nerf to the degenerate stance dancing stuff you could do with RJW, where you could swap into Energy Stance, Rushing Jade Wind, and then swap back, and you'd still get the healing. I don't think that kind of stance dancing was actually mathematically correct to do. Just getting rid of it entirely is a very good change, I think. And again, indicative of like a good developer attitude of just kind of nipping all this stupid stuff in the bud that makes things less fun to play. So a very good change here, although not like significant for Mistweaver overall. Jab cost lowered by 25% to 6% base mana from 8. This is huge. Fist weaving was close, but not quite as good as spamming Crackling Jade Lightning in terms of both DPS and healing. And so just these little marginal upgrades to fist weaving are going to go a long way to make it like the best playstyle, which I think it should be. So this is a good change overall, not like too crazy of a buff, but pretty good. You still definitely don't want to jab twice and uplift. This is basically just a buff to fist weaving, which I think is good. Enveloping Mist's healing raised by 48%. So this is your single target chi spender, and paired with the glyph of uplift over here is pretty good overall increase to the healing you do if you take this glyph. You don't really want to be pressing this button at all if you have uplift costing chi, but this is a very significant buff, right? So this is just really good for our tank healing, single target healing. So yeah, not like hugely significant, but again, pretty good buff if you are going to be playing the Glyph of Uplift style. This is a really, these changes in the bottom here are actually the hugest kind of like game-breaking crazy changes. So Eminence healing raised by 68%, moving it to 42% conversion of damage. And then with the like Stance the Wise Serpent 20%, it's 50%. So this means 100% of your damage if you have your statue down is going to be converted. So this is like a crazy buff to fist weaving. Basically, fist weaving just got double the healing from all your like Tiger Palm, jab, blackout kick, all that stuff, all your abilities. I don't think this affects the auto attack eminence from blackout kick. I'm not sure though. That's something we'll have to see from logs. I think it's just the eminence that you get for your special attacks. But if this does also affect auto attack, that's crazy huge. This basically just means that it's 100% that fist weaving is like the best playstyle in my opinion. And this is a very significant buff, especially given that Mistweaver already did the most damage. They're not nerfing your damage at all with fist weaving. CGL's damage got nerfed, but fist weaving damage got buffed, if anything, because jab has a lower mana cost now. So this is like crazy. This is something that we really have to pay attention to in raid testing. I honestly think that like this combined with some of this other stuff might make like one Mistweaver meta, especially combined with the Discipline Priest nerfs being so significant to their overall throughput. Having an extra healer that does very good throughput and also really good damage versus a Disc Priest might be correct in something like a 25-man. All right, so next, Revival's healing raised by 43%. Again, a 5.4 revert. Not like huge here. Your Revival is going to basically lay on hands the whole raid, which is pretty powerful though, so a nice little change here, making our cooldown a little bit better. This last change is kind of insane and very interesting, and the thing that I really want to math out along with the Eminence stuff. This basically just replaces targeted expulsion with Glyph of Uplift. However, Glyph of Uplift costs 10% of base mana. I believe it was originally like 8% and then it got nerfed to 16%. So I think this is like a little bit of a split the difference here. 10% base mana is pretty high, but Uplift is a very good spell, so This is something that's going to be very interesting to see if it's actually better than just spending your chi on uplift. However, if this 10% base mana is like worth it, this could be incredibly powerful for like burst AoE healing, and especially given how much fist weaving and eminence are buffed and how much our mana is buffed, having the ability to dump all of our mana into a Thunder Focus T spamming uplift with this glyph, this could make a huge difference in Mistweaver's healing profile and overall healing. So again, I'll be making a video after I do some math on this and look at the logs and stuff from the raid testing. My initial impression of this is that this is like a very significant buff to Mistweaver, and Mistweaver was like kind of close anyways. It does a crazy amount of damage and did pretty good healing. Very, very possible that like one Mistweaver becomes meta. Like if you look at Mistweaver's overall, like Chi Torpedo with CJL was doing like 250k raw in phase 1 BIS, which is like not actually that much lower than something like a Shaman. Obviously its profile's a lot different and its cooldowns are a lot worse, but being able to do this while doing 50k DPS or something, Mistweaver is like the boundary between this being very playable and not being meta is like pretty thin with how much insane damage it does, especially with something like Zwen. So very, very interested to see how this plays out in raid testing. That's the video. Thanks for watching. Send a like, subscribe, comment any questions you have below, etc. I have a Discord where you can ask questions as well, and I'll be releasing these spreadsheets I made too. So I got a little sneak peek of these here. These will be coming with my guides. Again, thanks for watching the video. See ya.
Swobu, Zug Zug.